The morning of September 15th, 2002, began like any other Saturday in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The maple trees lining Elm Street had just begun their transformation, their edges touched with the first hints of amber and gold. Inside the small two-story house with the white picket fence, 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez was having what her father, Miguel, would later remember as the most perfectly ordinary morning of her short life. Miguel had woken early, as was his habit on weekends, to prepare breakfast before his wife Maria returned from her overnight shift at the hospital. The smell of coffee brewing mixed with the sound of cartoons drifting from the living room, where Emma sat cross-legged on the carpet in her favorite purple pajamas, clutching a well-worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons. Her dark curls caught the morning light streaming through the sheer curtains, and she giggled at something Bugs Bunny had done on the screen. "Mija, breakfast is ready," Miguel called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a father who had learned to negotiate with a strong-willed toddler. Emma's response was immediate but predictable. She held up one small finger, eyes never leaving the television. "One more minute, puppy." Miguel smiled to himself as he arranged the scrambled eggs on her favorite plate, the one with the dancing elephants around the rim that Maria had bought at a garage sale the previous summer. He had learned that one more minute in Emma's vocabulary could mean anywhere from 30 seconds to half an hour, depending on her mood and the cartoon's plot development. This particular morning, patience felt easy. The weekend stretched ahead of them, with its promise of simple pleasures. A trip to the park, maybe ice cream if Emma ate all her vegetables at lunch, and the bedtime story ritual that had become sacred in their household. The Rodriguez family had moved to Cedar Falls 3 years earlier, when Miguel accepted a position as a maintenance supervisor at the local community college. It was a good job with steady hours and benefits, exactly what they needed as they prepared to start their family. The town of 8,000 people had welcomed them warmly, and they had quickly found their rhythm in the close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, usually in the kindest possible way. Maria worked as a registered nurse at the regional medical center, often pulling overnight shifts that paid a differential they couldn't afford to refuse. The arrangement meant that Miguel and Emma had developed their own special bond during those quiet Saturday mornings while Maria slept off her night shifts. They would have breakfast together, then venture out for adventures that seemed monumental to a 3-year-old and precious beyond measure to a father who had grown up without such moments himself. On this particular morning, Emma eventually abandoned Bugs Bunny for the more immediate appeal of scrambled eggs and orange juice. She chattered constantly as she ate, a stream of consciousness that jumped from observations about the color of her eggs to questions about why birds could fly but she couldn't, to detailed plans for teaching Mr. Buttons how to use the potty. Miguel listened to every word, responding with the serious attention that her pronouncements deserved, occasionally wiping errant crumbs from her chin with a patience that came naturally to him. After breakfast, Emma insisted on helping with the dishes, which meant standing on a step stool at the sink and creating more work than she actually accomplished. But Miguel had learned that these moments of helping were when she talked the most, when her little mind processed the world around her through questions and observations that often surprised him with their insight. Today she was particularly interested in the concept of hiding, inspired by a game of hide-and-seek they had played the evening before. "Papi, where's the best hiding place in the whole world?" she asked, her small hands submerged in soapy water as she concentrated on washing a plastic cup. Miguel considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Well, mija, I think the best hiding place is somewhere safe, where people who love you can find you when it's time to come out." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this wisdom confirmed something she had already suspected. "Like behind the couch, but not under the bed because it's dark and Mr. Buttons gets scared." "Exactly like that," Miguel agreed, lifting her down from the step stool and kissing the top of her head. Her hair smelled like the baby shampoo they still used, even though she insisted she was a big girl who didn't need help with most things. By 10 o'clock, Maria had awakened and joined them for a second cup of coffee, her scrubs exchanged for comfortable jeans and one of Miguel's old college t-shirts. She looked tired but content, the kind of tiredness that came from meaningful work rather than drudgery. Emma immediately launched into a recap of her morning, complete with dramatic reenactments of the cartoons she had watched and detailed descriptions of how she had helped with breakfast. The family decided to spend the day at Wilson Park, a sprawling green space on the edge of town that featured a playground, several walking trails, and a small pond where ducks gathered hopefully whenever children appeared with breadcrumbs. Emma loved the park with the fierce devotion that only small children can muster for their favorite places. She knew the location of every swing, every slide, every interesting rock or stick that had caught her attention on previous visits. As they prepared to leave, Miguel grabbed his old cassette recorder from the hall closet, the same device he had used in college to record lectures and later to document Emma's first words, first steps, and first songs. He had developed a habit of recording random moments with Emma, partly for posterity, and partly because her observations were so delightfully unpredictable that he wanted to preserve them exactly as she said them. "We're going on an adventure," he announced into the microphone as Emma clapped her hands in delight. She loved when he recorded their activities, often grabbing the device to add her own commentary in the serious tone she reserved for important announcements. The drive to Wilson Park took less than 10 minutes, but Emma treated it like a grand expedition, pointing out familiar landmarks and offering running commentary on the activities of other families they passed along the way. Miguel found himself thinking, as he often did during these ordinary moments, how lucky they were to have found this life together in this quiet corner of Iowa, where their daughter could grow up surrounded by safety and love. If stories like these move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, love continues to guide us home. Consider subscribing to hear more stories that touch the heart. None of them could have imagined, as they pulled into the parking lot at Wilson Park, and Emma squealed with excitement at the sight of the playground, that this would be the last normal moment their family would ever share. The cassette recorder in Miguel's jacket pocket contained what would become the final recording of his daughter's voice, chattering happily about the ducks she planned to visit and the highest swing she intended to conquer. In less than 3 hours, Emma Rodriguez would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Cedar Falls for the next 20 years. Wilson Park on a September afternoon was a symphony of childhood joy. The playground bustled with families taking advantage of the perfect weather, warm enough for t-shirts, but cool enough that parents didn't worry about overheating. Emma Rodriguez ran toward the swings with the unstoppable momentum of a 3-year-old who had been cooped up indoors, her small legs pumping as fast as they could carry her across the wood-chip-covered ground. Miguel and Maria followed at a more leisurely pace, hands linked, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching their daughter's unbridled excitement. They had claimed a picnic table in the shade of an old oak tree, close enough to the playground to supervise, but far enough away to give Emma the independence she craved. Maria unpacked the small cooler they had brought, laying out juice boxes and the peanut butter crackers that served as Emma's standard park snack. "Push me, puppy, push me to the clouds," Emma called from the swing set, her legs kicking enthusiastically as she tried to propel herself higher. Miguel jogged over to give her the boost she needed, and soon she was soaring back and forth, her delighted squeals mixing with the ambient sounds of other children playing. The cassette recorder remained in Miguel's jacket pocket, occasionally capturing fragments of their afternoon. as he absent-mindedly pressed the record button during particularly memorable moments. Emma's voice, bright and clear, documented her conquests. "I went down the big slide all by myself, and Mama watched me climb like a monkey, and Mr. Buttons wants a turn on the swings too." Other families at the park that day would later tell police that the Rodriguez family seemed perfectly normal, perfectly happy. Several parents had chatted briefly with Miguel and Maria, the kind of casual conversations that happen naturally in small towns, where familiar faces are common. Everyone remembered Emma, her infectious giggle, her confident navigation of playground equipment meant for older children, her careful attention to Mr. Buttons, whom she insisted needed to experience every activity alongside her. Around 2 o'clock, Emma announced that she was ready to visit the ducks. The pond was located about 50 yards from the playground, connected by a well-maintained walking path that meandered through a grove of willows. Miguel and Maria had made this walk dozens of times with Emma, who had an established ritual for duck feeding that involved approaching the water's edge with great ceremony and distributing breadcrumbs with the solemnity of someone performing an important civic duty. They walked together along the familiar path, Emma skipping ahead, but staying within the boundaries her parents had established over many previous visits. The pond came into view through the trees, its surface disturbed by the gentle movements of mallards and Canada geese, who had learned to associate human visitors with food offerings. Emma clapped her hands in delight at the sight of more ducks than usual gathered near the shore. "Lots of duck friends today," she announced, then immediately began her approach to the water's edge. Mr. Buttons tucked securely under one arm, and her other hand extended toward Miguel for the breadcrumbs he carried in a small paper bag. What happened next would be reconstructed later through witness statements, security footage from the park's single camera, and the desperate memories of parents who would replay every second of that afternoon for the rest of their lives. Emma had been feeding the ducks for perhaps 10 minutes, chattering to them in the conversational tone she used with all animals, when she announced that Mr. Buttons had dropped something important in the reeds near the water's edge. Miguel and Maria were sitting on a nearby bench, watching their daughter's interaction with the waterfowl and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. They could see Emma clearly, could hear her voice as she explained to the ducks that she needed to help Mr. Buttons find his lost button, an ongoing saga in the bear's imaginary life that Emma took very seriously. "I'll be right back, duck friends," Emma told her audience, then walked toward a cluster of cattails and reeds about 20 feet from where her parents sat. It was still well within their line of sight, still within the safe perimeter they had established for her independent exploration. Miguel pressed the record button on his cassette player almost without thinking, wanting to capture Emma's earnest conversation with her stuffed animal. Her voice came through clearly. "Don't worry, Mr. Buttons. We'll find it. It's probably hiding like we practiced this morning." Then, in the space of time it takes to blink, Emma Rodriguez simply disappeared. Maria would later swear that she had looked away for no more than 5 seconds to retrieve a juice box from their bag. Miguel would insist that his eyes had been on Emma when she walked into the reeds, but that somehow in the next moment she was simply gone. The ducks continued their lazy paddling, the other park visitors continued their conversations and activities, and the autumn afternoon continued its peaceful progression as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Miguel's first reaction was confusion rather than panic. Emma was an accomplished hider, and her morning conversation about hiding places was fresh in his mind. He called her name in the patient tone he used when she was being particularly creative about avoiding bedtime or vegetable consumption. "Emma, mija, time to come out now." Silence. Maria joined him at the edge of the reeds, her voice carrying the first note of concern. "Emma, sweetheart, Mama's here. Come on out." Still nothing. Miguel waded into the shallow water at the pond's edge, pushing aside cattails and calling Emma's name with increasing urgency. The water was clear enough to see the bottom, and there was nowhere in the small cluster of reeds where a 3-year-old could hide. The area wasn't large enough to conceal a child, wasn't deep enough for her to have fallen and been submerged. Within minutes, other parents had joined the search. Within an hour, the Cedar Falls Police Department had cordoned off the area and begun what would become the most extensive missing person investigation in the county's history. Within 24 hours, FBI agents had arrived from Des Moines, and Emma Rodriguez's photograph was being broadcast on every television station in Iowa. The cassette recorder, still running in Miguel's jacket pocket, captured the exact moment when their world changed forever. His voice, initially calm and then increasingly frantic, calling Emma's name. Maria's sobs, the arrival of police officers and emergency responders, the questions that had no answers. How does a 3-year-old vanish in broad daylight from an open area with multiple witnesses nearby? Where could she have gone? Who could have taken her, and how? In the 20 years that followed, those questions would remain unanswered. Emma Rodriguez had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of her voice on a cassette recording and the memory of a family's last perfect morning together. In the hours immediately following Emma's disappearance, Wilson Park transformed from a peaceful community gathering place into the epicenter of the most intensive search operation Cedar Falls had ever witnessed. As word spread through the tight-knit community, volunteers arrived in waves. Neighbors, co-workers, church members, and complete strangers who had heard the news on local radio and felt compelled to help. Miguel and Maria found themselves at the center of a controlled chaos they couldn't fully comprehend. One moment they had been a family of 3 enjoying a September afternoon. The next, they were separated into different areas of the park, answering questions from law enforcement officers who spoke in calm, professional tones that somehow made everything feel more terrifying rather than less. Detective Sarah Chen of the Cedar Falls Police Department had 23 years of experience, but child abduction cases still affected her differently than other investigations. She approached Miguel with the careful balance of urgency and reassurance that she had perfected over the years, knowing that the first few hours were crucial, but that panicked parents provided less useful information than calm ones. "Mr. Rodriguez, I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need you to walk me through everything that happened this afternoon, starting from when you arrived at the park," Detective Chen said, her notebook ready but her attention focused entirely on Miguel's face. "Take your time and include every detail you can remember, no matter how small it might seem." Miguel's hands shook as he retrieved the cassette recorder from his jacket pocket. "I was recording her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I record her sometimes, just little moments. Her voice is on here from right before she disappeared." Detective Chen's expression shifted slightly as she looked at the small device. Physical evidence from the exact time of a disappearance was rare, potentially invaluable. "Mr. Rodriguez, this could be very important. Are you comfortable letting us listen to the recording?" As the sun began to set over Wilson Park, casting long shadows across the search area, Miguel pressed play on the device that had captured his daughter's last known words. Emma's voice filled the air around them, bright and unconcerned. "Don't worry, Mr. Buttons. We'll find it. It's probably hiding like we practiced this morning." The recording continued for several more minutes, capturing the sounds of the park, other children playing, ducks splashing in the water, the rustle of reeds in the breeze. Then Miguel's voice, initially patient, "Emma, mija, time to come out now." The progression from patience to concern to panic was audible, heartbreaking in its clarity. Detective Chen listened to the entire recording twice, making notes about timeline and background sounds. The cassette also captured the voices of other park visitors, conversations that might provide additional witnesses or information about anyone who had been in the area around the time of Emma's disappearance. Meanwhile, the physical search expanded beyond the immediate area around the pond. Canine units arrived from the state police, their German shepherds trained specifically for finding missing persons. The dogs picked up Emma's scent from clothing Miguel had retrieved from their car, but the trail ended abruptly at the water's edge, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Maria sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon temperature, answering the same questions over and over for different investigators. A victim's advocate from the County Social Services Department stayed close by, offering water and tissues and the kind of steady presence that people in crisis often need more than they realize. "She's never wandered off before," Maria repeated for the fourth time to a new detective. "Emma is adventurous, but she knows the rules. She knows to stay where we can see her. She's only 3, but she's very good about boundaries." The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team arrived from Des Moines just as darkness began to fall. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez had worked hundreds of missing child cases, and she knew that statistics were both an enemy and an ally in investigations like this one. Most missing children were found within the first few hours, either having wandered off and been located quickly, or in more troubling cases, taken by someone known to the family. But Emma's disappearance didn't fit the typical patterns. "Tell me about Emma's routine," Agent Martinez asked Miguel as they sat in the park's small visitor center, which had been converted into a temporary command post. "Who does she interact with regularly? Daycare, babysitters, neighbors, family, friends?" Miguel struggled to focus on the questions. His mind kept returning to the moment when he had looked toward the reeds and realized Emma was gone. How long had he actually been looking away? Seconds? A minute? Had there been someone else in the area that he hadn't noticed? "She goes to Little Lamb's daycare 3 days a week," he said, forcing himself to concentrate on the agent's questions. "Mrs. Patterson has been running it for 15 years. Everyone knows everyone there. Emma loves her teachers, Miss Julie and Miss Carmen, and Maria's sister Rosa watches her sometimes when we both have to work." Agent Martinez made notes, knowing that in missing child cases, it was essential to examine every relationship, every routine, every person who had regular contact with the victim. Most child abductions were committed by someone the child knew and trusted, someone who could approach without causing alarm. The search continued through the night under portable floodlights that turned Wilson Park into an otherworldly landscape of harsh shadows and desperate activity. Volunteers combed through every inch of the surrounding woods, calling Emma's name until their voices grew hoarse. Divers searched the pond and the creek that fed into it, though the water was too shallow and clear for a child to remain hidden. Local news crews arrived around midnight, setting up their equipment at a respectful distance from the command post. The story of 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez's disappearance would lead the morning news broadcasts across Iowa and begin appearing on national missing children websites before dawn. Miguel and Maria were eventually taken to the police station to provide more detailed statements and to work with a sketch artist who would create composite drawings of anyone they remembered seeing at the park that day. The process was exhausting and surreal, trying to recall faces from what had been until that afternoon, just another pleasant family outing. "I keep thinking I should remember something important," Miguel told Detective Chen as they reviewed his statement for the 3rd time. "Like there should have been a sign or someone suspicious or something that didn't feel right, but it was just a normal day. Everything was normal." Detective Chen had heard similar statements from hundreds of families over the years. The reality was that most crimes, even the most devastating ones, happened during perfectly ordinary moments when people had no reason to be on guard. It was one of the cruel ironies of police work. The worst days of people's lives usually began as the most mundane. As the first week of searching stretched into the second, then the third, the initial frenzy of activity began to settle into the grinding routine of a long-term investigation. Volunteers still came, but in smaller numbers. The media attention remained intense, but shifted toward broader questions about child safety and community protection. Miguel returned to work at the community college, though his supervisor had made it clear that he could take as much time as he needed. Maria extended her leave from the hospital, unable to imagine caring for other people's children when her own remained missing. They moved through their days in a fog of exhaustion and false hope, jumping every time the phone rang, studying every small face they passed on the street. The cassette recorder sat on their kitchen table, a tangible connection to Emma's voice that they both treasured and couldn't bear to hear. Miguel had made copies for the police investigation, but the original remained with them, a 20-minute window into the last normal day their family would ever know. 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, with no new leads and no credible sightings despite thousands of tips and reports, the investigation shifted from active search to long-term missing person case. The command post at Wilson Park was dismantled, the floodlights removed, the yellow tape taken down. Life in Cedar Falls slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, though Emma's photograph remained posted in every business window, and her story continued to haunt the community's collective memory. Miguel and Maria Rodriguez were left to navigate a new reality they had never imagined, life as the parents of a missing child, suspended between hope and grief, waiting for answers that might never come. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit arrived in Cedar Falls 6 weeks after Emma's disappearance, bringing with them a different perspective on the case that had baffled local and state investigators. Special Agent Dr. James Morrison had spent 15 years studying child abduction cases, and he approached the Rodriguez investigation with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most important clues were often hidden in plain sight. Dr. Morrison set up his temporary office in a conference room at the Cedar Falls Police Department, covering the walls with maps, photographs, timeline charts, and copies of every piece of evidence collected during the investigation. The cassette recording played a central role in his analysis, not just Emma's final words, but every sound captured during those crucial minutes when she vanished. Background audio can tell us as much as direct conversation, Dr. C. Morrison explained to Detective Chen as they listened to the recording for what felt like the 100th time. Listen here, at 2:17 p.m. according to your timeline. Do you hear that sound underneath Emma's voice? Detective Chen strained to listen past Emma's cheerful chatter with Mr. Buttons. There, a faint mechanical sound, almost like a car door closing, but muffled by distance and the ambient noise of the park. Could be a vehicle, Dr. Morrison continued. The park's main entrance is about 200 yards from the pond, but sound carries differently over water. If someone parked near the entrance around the time Emma disappeared, the cassette might have picked it up. The investigative team had interviewed hundreds of people in the weeks following Emma's disappearance. Every family that had been at Wilson Park that day, every resident who lived near the park's perimeter, every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius. But Dr. Morrison's fresh analysis suggested they might need to expand their focus beyond the immediate area. Miguel and Maria had been asked to come to the station for what Detective Chen described as a consultation with our behavioral specialist. They sat across from Dr. Morrison in the same conference room where Emma's case files now covered every available surface, trying to answer questions they had been asked dozens of times before, but with a new focus on psychological details rather than physical evidence. "Tell me about Emma's personality," Dr. Morrison said, his voice gentle but precise. "Was she cautious with strangers, or was she the type of child who might approach someone she didn't know?" Maria twisted her hands in her lap, a gesture that had become unconscious over the past weeks. She was friendly, but not naive. We taught her about stranger danger, about not going anywhere with people she didn't know, but she was also very trusting. If someone seemed nice, if they were gentle with her. She loved helping people, Miguel added. If she saw someone who seemed sad or lost, she would want to help them feel better. It's just who she was. Dr. Morrison made notes, building a psychological profile not just of Emma, but of the type of person who might have been able to gain her trust quickly enough to convince her to leave the safety of her parents' sight. The behavioral analysis suggested they were looking for someone who appeared non-threatening, possibly someone who had observed Emma's helpful nature during previous visits to the park. The investigation expanded to include a deeper examination of the park's regular visitors. Wilson Park hosted everything from family reunions to company picnics to youth soccer games, and the Rodriguez family had been regulars for over 2 years. Someone familiar with their routine could have known that Saturday afternoons often brought Miguel, Maria, and Emma to the playground and pond area. Detective Chen spent days reviewing the park's informal guest book, which visitors sometimes signed during organized events, and interviewing the maintenance staff who worked there regularly. Tom Bradley, the head groundskeeper, had been employed by the city's parks department for 12 years and knew most of the regular families by sight. "The Rodriguez family, sure, I knew them," Tom told Detective Chen during an interview at his small office in the park's maintenance building. "Sweet little girl, always polite. They came most Saturday afternoons when the weather was nice. Always went to the playground first, then the pond to feed the ducks." "Did you notice anyone else who seemed to pay particular attention to families with young children?" Detective Chen asked. "Anyone who showed up regularly but didn't seem to have children of their own?" Tom considered the question carefully. "Well, there was this one guy who came around sometimes, middle-aged, always alone, said he was a photographer working on a project about community spaces. He had a fancy camera, professional-looking equipment. I saw him taking pictures of families, but he always asked permission first. Seemed harmless enough." Detective Chen felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a potential lead. "Do you remember his name? What he looked like?" "Called himself Dave something." "Davidson? Davison?" "He had business cards. Said he was freelance, working on a book about small-town America. Average height, brown hair, maybe 45 or 50. Drove an older blue sedan, I think." Within hours, Detective Chen had assembled a task force to track down every photographer who had been working in the Cedar Falls area during the months leading up to Emma's disappearance. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation provided additional resources, and the FBI's database of missing children cases was searched for similar patterns. Photographers who had gained access to families and children under the pretense of professional documentation. The search led to David Carlson, a 47-year-old freelance photographer from Iowa City, who had indeed been working on a project about community gathering places in small Iowa towns. His portfolio included dozens of photographs taken at Wilson Park and other similar locations throughout the state, all with proper model releases and apparent parental consent. When investigators contacted David Carlson at his Iowa City apartment, they found a man who seemed genuinely shocked by their questions about Emma Rodriguez's disappearance. His photography equipment was professional and well-maintained, his business records were organized and legitimate, and his alibi for September 15, 2002 was solid. He had been shooting a wedding in Cedar Rapids, with dozens of witnesses and professional contracts to verify his whereabouts. "I heard about the missing little girl on the news," Carlson told Agent Martinez during a voluntary interview at the FBI's Des Moines field office. "It's heartbreaking. I have a daughter myself, lives with her mother in Chicago. The idea that someone would hurt a child—" He shook his head, clearly disturbed by the implications of the investigation. The photographer lead, like so many others, ultimately led nowhere. But Dr. Morrison's behavioral analysis had opened new avenues of investigation, and the enhanced audio analysis of Miguel's cassette recording had identified at least 3 distinct background sounds that warranted further examination. The possible car door, what might have been footsteps on the wooden boardwalk that connected different areas of the park, and a faint voice calling someone's name, though not clearly enough to determine if it was someone calling for Emma. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation continued with the methodical persistence that characterizes cold cases. Every tip was followed up, every lead investigated, every theory examined. Miguel and Maria Rodriguez had learned to live with the constant presence of law enforcement in their lives, with the phone calls from investigators and reporters, with the well-meaning but exhausting sympathy of their community. The cassette recorder remained on their kitchen table, a daily reminder of Emma's voice, and the last normal conversation their family had shared. Sometimes, late at night, when neither of them could sleep, Miguel would play the tape softly, just to hear his daughter's laughter one more time, and to remember what their life had been like before September 15, 2002, changed everything forever. 20 years is a lifetime measured in the gradual accumulation of small changes that eventually transform everything. For Miguel and Maria Rodriguez, the 2 decades following Emma's disappearance had been marked not by dramatic events, but by the slow process of learning to carry an absence that never grew lighter, only more familiar. Miguel's hair had gone completely grey by his 50th birthday, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering where his daughter might be sleeping. He had been promoted twice at the community college, eventually becoming the head of facilities management, a position that kept him busy enough during the day to avoid dwelling on questions that had no answers. But the busyness was deliberate, a carefully constructed defense against the thoughts that waited for quiet moments. Maria had returned to nursing after taking a year off following Emma's disappearance, but she had requested a transfer to the pediatric ward, explaining to her supervisor that she needed to be around children who were healing rather than adults who were dying. Her colleagues understood without her having to elaborate. In Cedar Falls, everyone knew the story of the Rodriguez family, and Maria's gentle way with frightened children had become legendary among the hospital staff. The house on Elm Street had been remodeled twice over the years, partly out of necessity and partly from the restless energy that comes from living with unresolved grief. Miguel had expanded the kitchen, updated the bathroom, refinished the hardwood floors, and painted every room at least 3 times. But Emma's room remained exactly as it had been on September 15, 2002. Her toddler bed still made with the purple comforter she had loved, Mr. Buttons's twin brother, purchased after the original disappeared with Emma, sitting in the same spot on her pillow. They had tried to have other children. 2 miscarriages in the years immediately following Emma's disappearance had added layers of loss that tested their marriage in ways neither had anticipated. But they had worked through the grief together, attending counseling sessions and finding ways to honor Emma's memory while still leaving room for hope in their lives. Miguel had started a scholarship fund at the community college in Emma's name, providing financial assistance to students studying early childhood education. Maria volunteered with the local chapter of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, offering support to other families navigating the nightmare they knew too well. These activities gave shape to their grief, transforming their loss into something that could help others. Detective Sarah Chen had retired from the Cedar Falls Police Department in 2018, but she still kept Emma's case file in her home office, still followed up on leads that occasionally trickled in through the National Missing Children database. She and Miguel exchanged Christmas cards every year, a ritual that acknowledged their shared connection to a mystery that had defined both of their careers, his as a father, hers as an investigator. The cassette recorder had been professionally cleaned and maintained over the years. The tape itself transferred to digital format to prevent degradation. Miguel had given copies to Emma's grandparents, to Maria's sister Rosa, to Detective Chen, and to several other law enforcement agencies that had requested them for their files. But the original tape remained on their kitchen table, played so many times that both Miguel and Maria could recite Emma's words exactly as she had spoken them. "Don't worry, Mr. Buttons, we'll find it. It's probably hiding like we practiced this morning." The words had taken on additional meaning over the years, becoming almost a mantra of hope. Emma had been talking about finding something Mr. Buttons had lost, but Miguel and Maria had come to interpret her words as a message about their own search, a reminder that sometimes the most important things were hidden but not lost forever. Wilson Park had undergone its own transformation during the 20 years since Emma's disappearance. A new playground had been installed in 2010, with updated safety features and better sight lines for supervising parents. A small memorial garden had been created near the pond, not specifically for Emma, but for all of Cedar Falls' lost children, with a bench dedicated to the importance of community vigilance and care. Miguel and Maria still visited the park occasionally, usually on Emma's birthday or on the anniversary of her disappearance. They would sit on the memorial bench and watch other families enjoying the same simple pleasures they had shared with their daughter, feeling both grateful for those memories and heartbroken that they had ended so abruptly. The investigation into Emma's disappearance had never been officially closed, but it had long since moved from active status to cold case. Advances in DNA analysis had prompted periodic reviews of the physical evidence, and the emergence of new databases and investigative techniques had generated occasional flurries of activity. But no new information had emerged that significantly advanced the case. Dr. Morrison's behavioral analysis had been updated several times over the years, incorporating new research about child abduction patterns and perpetrator psychology. The enhanced audio analysis of Miguel's cassette recording had been repeated using increasingly sophisticated technology, identifying additional background sounds, but nothing that led to concrete leads. In 2019, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation had launched a cold case initiative, assigning fresh investigators to review unsolved missing person cases from the previous 3 decades. Emma's file was among the first to be re-examined, and Agent Lisa Park, a specialist in long-term missing child cases, had contacted Miguel and Maria for updated interviews. Time sometimes provides perspective that wasn't available during the initial investigation, Agent Park had explained during their meeting at the family's kitchen table, the same table where the cassette recorder still sat after all these years. People remember things differently after 20 years. Relationships change. Someone who couldn't speak up before might be ready to come forward now. But the renewed investigation had yielded nothing new. The same witnesses, the same timeline, the same inexplicable disappearance of a 3-year-old girl from an open area under her parents' watchful eyes. If anything, the passage of time had made the mystery more puzzling rather than less so, as potential suspects had died or moved away, and physical evidence had degraded beyond useful analysis. Miguel had retired from the community college in 2020, and he and Maria had talked about selling the house on Elm Street, perhaps moving closer to Maria's family in Texas, or finding a smaller place that didn't echo with memories of footsteps that would never come running down the hallway again. But they had never quite been able to take that step, held in place by the irrational but persistent belief that Emma might someday find her way home and would need to know where to look for them. On quiet evenings when the house felt too empty and the silence too complete, Miguel would sometimes take the cassette recorder to Emma's room and play her voice one more time. Maria would find him there, sitting on the small bed with tears on his cheeks, holding Mr. Button's replacement and listening to their daughter's final recorded words, with the desperate attention of someone trying to decode a message that might explain the unexplainable. "She sounds so happy," Maria would whisper, settling beside Miguel on the narrow bed. "She sounds safe." And that was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the recording, Emma's complete trust in her world, her absolute confidence that her parents would keep her safe, that Mr. Button's lost button would be found, that the ducks would wait patiently for her return, that tomorrow would bring another perfect Saturday morning filled with cartoons and scrambled eggs and all the small rituals that make childhood magical. 20 years had taught Miguel and Maria Rodriguez how to live with questions that had no answers, how to find meaning in a life fundamentally altered by loss, how to love a daughter they could no longer hold. They had learned that grief doesn't end, but it does evolve, transforming from the sharp agony of fresh loss into something more complex, a bittersweet appreciation for the time they had been given, mixed with the endless ache of all the time that had been stolen. The Community College Scholarship Fund in Emma's name had helped dozens of students pursue careers in early childhood education. Maria's work with missing children's families had provided comfort and guidance to parents navigating their own unimaginable circumstances. These were not substitutes for the daughter they had lost, but they were ways of ensuring that Emma's brief life continued to have meaning, continued to make a difference in the world she had left too soon. As 2022 dawned, marking 20 years since Emma's disappearance, Miguel and Maria Rodriguez had settled into a routine that honored both their loss and their resilience. They attended church regularly, maintained close relationships with extended family, traveled occasionally to visit Maria's relatives in Texas, and found small joys in their daily lives: Miguel's woodworking projects, Maria's garden, the books they read together in the evenings. But the cassette recorder remained on the kitchen table, and Emma's room remained exactly as she had left it, and every September 15th brought the same ritual of remembrance and hope that had sustained them through 2 decades of not knowing. They had learned to live with uncertainty, but they had never learned to stop believing that someday, somehow, they might finally understand what had happened to their daughter on that perfect autumn afternoon when their world changed forever. The 20-year anniversary of Emma's disappearance would bring renewed media attention, updated age progression photographs, and another round of appeals for information from the public. Miguel and Maria would participate in these efforts with the same grace and dignity they had shown throughout their ordeal, still holding on to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew something that could bring them closer to the truth. Neither of them could have imagined that the answer they had been seeking for 2 decades was about to emerge from the most unexpected source: a forgotten box in an attic, and a voice from the past that would finally break the silence surrounding their daughter's fate. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2022, just as Miguel was finishing his second cup of coffee and reviewing the seed catalogs that had arrived with the spring mail. Maria was at the hospital, pulling a double shift to cover for a colleague who had called in sick, and the house on Elm Street was filled with the particular quiet that Miguel had never quite learned to enjoy. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Detective Angela Morris with the Cedar Falls Police Department. I'm calling about Emma's case. Miguel's hand tightened on the phone receiver. After 20 years, he had received dozens of similar calls, updates on dead-end leads, requests for additional information, notifications about new investigative techniques that might be applied to Emma's case. He had learned to manage his expectations, to listen politely without allowing hope to build too high. "What can I do for you, Detective Morris?" he asked, settling back into his kitchen chair with the weary patience of someone who had answered these questions many times before. "Sir, we've received some evidence that I'd like you and your wife to take a look at. Are you available to come down to the station this afternoon?" Something in Detective Morris's tone was different from the routine updates Miguel had received over the years. There was an undercurrent of excitement, barely contained, that made his heart rate quicken despite his efforts to remain calm. "What kind of evidence?" Miguel asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer. "I'd prefer to show you in person, Mr. Rodriguez. Can you contact your wife and ask her to meet us here around 2 o'clock? The drive to the Cedar Falls Police Department felt simultaneously too long and too short. Miguel and Maria rode in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might be about to learn. 20 years of waiting had taught them that police calls could bring devastating news as easily as hopeful developments, and they had learned to steel themselves for either possibility. Detective Morris was younger than Sarah Chen had been, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that Miguel recognized from the early days of Emma's investigation. She led them to the same conference room where they had answered countless questions over the years, but this time the atmosphere felt different, charged with possibility rather than weighed down by frustration. "Before I show you what we've found, I need to explain how we came to have it," Detective Morris began, settling across from them at the familiar table. 3 days ago, we received a call from Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. She used to run the Little Lambs daycare where Emma attended. Miguel and Maria exchanged glances. They remembered Mrs. Patterson well, a kind woman in her 60s who had retired from running the daycare several years after Emma's disappearance, citing the emotional toll of the investigation and the constant reminders of the child she had loved. "Mrs. Patterson has been cleaning out her attic, preparing to move to a senior living facility," Detective Morris continued. "She found a box of items from the daycare that she had stored away after she closed the business. Most of it was routine: children's artwork, old lesson plans, administrative paperwork. But there was also this." Detective Morris reached into an evidence bag and withdrew a small cassette recorder, similar to the one Miguel had used to capture Emma's voice, but newer, with a digital display and more advanced features. Mrs. Patterson said she had forgotten about this recorder completely. She bought it in 2002, thinking she might use it to document the children's activities for a promotional video about the daycare. She made a few recordings, but never followed through with the project. The recorder ended up in a storage box and was forgotten. Miguel's hands were trembling as he stared at the device. "Are you saying there might be recordings of Emma on there?" "We've listened to the tape, Mr. Rodriguez. There are recordings from several different days, all from September 2002. Emma appears on 3 of them." Detective Morris paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "But there's something else. Something we need you to listen to." The detective pressed play on a modern digital player, and suddenly the conference room was filled with the sounds of children at play, laughter, singing, the cheerful chaos of a well-run daycare center. Miguel and Maria could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice in the background, gently directing activities and answering questions. Then clear and unmistakable Emma's voice. "Mrs. Patterson, can you help me find my special hiding place? Papi taught me about good hiding places, but I want to practice." Mrs. Patterson's voice responded, "Of course, sweetheart. Where would you like to practice hiding?" Emma's answer made both Miguel and Maria gasp. In the secret room behind the bookshelf, Papi showed me how to open it, but I want to make sure I remember, in case we ever need to play hide-and-seek for real." Detective Morris stopped the recording. "Mr. Rodriguez, do you know what Emma was referring to? What secret room?" Miguel's mind raced back to the countless hours he had spent at Little Lamb's daycare, picking Emma up after work, attending parent conferences, helping with minor maintenance issues when Mrs. Patterson needed assistance. The daycare was housed in a converted Victorian mansion full of interesting architectural features and unexpected nooks and crannies. "There was a space behind the built-in bookshelf in what used to be the library," Miguel said slowly, the memory crystallizing as he spoke. The previous owners had converted a small storage closet into a kind of secret room, probably for the children who lived there originally. Mrs. Patterson used it to store supplies, but Emma was fascinated by how the bookshelf opened on hidden hinges. "I showed her how it worked one day when she was particularly curious," Miguel continued, his voice growing stronger as the memory became clearer. "I thought it was harmless, just a 3-year-old's fascination with secret passages. She made me promise not to tell anyone else about it because she wanted it to be her special discovery." Maria was staring at her husband with an expression of dawning understanding mixed with something that might have been horror. "Miguel, you don't think—" Detective Morris leaned forward in her chair. "Mrs. Patterson gave us keys to the daycare building. It's been empty since she retired, but the new owners haven't done any major renovations yet. We'd like your permission to search that hidden room." The drive to Little Lamb's daycare felt surreal, like traveling back in time to a period of their lives that belonged to a different family. The family they had been before September 15th, 2002, changed everything. The Victorian mansion looked smaller than Miguel remembered, shabby after years of vacancy, with an overgrown yard and windows that stared blankly at the street. Detective Morris led them through the front door into rooms that still smelled faintly of childhood, crayons and Play-Doh, and the lingering essence of snack time. The library was exactly as Miguel remembered it, with built-in bookshelves covering most of one wall and a reading corner where Mrs. Patterson had conducted story time. Miguel approached the bookshelf with hands that shook despite his efforts to remain calm. The hidden mechanism was simple, a small lever disguised as a decorative element that, when pressed, allowed a section of the bookshelf to swing inward on concealed hinges. The secret room was small, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet, with a low ceiling that would have been perfect for a child's hideaway. It was dark inside, and Detective Morris used a flashlight to illuminate the space. In the far corner, partially hidden under a child-sized blanket that Miguel recognized as one Emma had used during nap time at the daycare, was a small cardboard box. Detective Morris carefully retrieved the box and brought it into the library, where the light was better. Inside, they found items that made Miguel's knees buckle. Mr. Buttons, Emma's beloved teddy bear, still wearing the small blue jacket Maria had sewn for him. A juice box, long since expired. A small baggie containing crackers that had crumbled to dust. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a Ziploc bag, another cassette recorder. "She made herself a hiding place," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She was practicing, like she said on the recording. She was getting ready to hide." Detective Morris handled the second cassette recorder with the same careful attention she had given the first. "We'll need to process all of this as evidence, but I think we should listen to this recording right now with both of you present." Miguel nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready to hear whatever message his daughter had left behind. After 20 years of questions, the possibility of answers felt almost too overwhelming to bear. The recorder was an older model, similar to the one Miguel had used at Wilson Park, and it took Detective Morris a moment to figure out the controls. When she pressed play, Emma's voice filled the room once again, but this time with a different quality. She was speaking quietly, as if she didn't want to be overheard. "Hi, it's me, Emma. I'm practicing hiding like Papi taught me. If something scary happens and I need to hide, I know where to go. Mrs. Patterson doesn't know I come here sometimes when I'm supposed to be napping. It's my secret place, just for me and Mr. Buttons." There was a pause, and they could hear Emma moving around in the small space, probably arranging her supplies. "I brought snacks in case I have to hide for a long time, and I brought Mr. Buttons so he won't be scared. Papi says the best hiding places are where people who love you can find you, but bad people can't. I think this is a good hiding place." The recording continued for several more minutes, with Emma chattering to Mr. Buttons and describing her plans for making the secret room more comfortable. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing any other childhood game. But then, toward the end of the recording, Emma's tone changed. "Someone's coming. I hear footsteps. I have to be quiet now." The recording ended abruptly, leaving the three adults in stunned silence as the implications of what they had just heard began to sink in. The silence in the empty daycare library stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Miguel, Maria, and Detective Morris sat frozen in place, staring at the small cassette recorder that had just delivered the first concrete clue about Emma's disappearance in 20 years. "She wasn't at the park," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "She wasn't at the park when she disappeared." Detective Morris was already reaching for her radio, calling for additional units and the forensics team that would need to process what had suddenly become a potential crime scene. But Miguel was focused on a detail that sent ice through his veins, the timestamp on the recording, visible on the digital display of Emma's hidden cassette player. "Detective," Miguel said, his voice hollow, "look at the date on the recording." Detective Morris examined the display and felt her own blood run cold. The recording was dated September 16, 2002, the day after Emma had disappeared from Wilson Park. "That's impossible," Maria said, reaching for the recorder as if she could somehow change what the display showed. She was gone by then. She was already missing. But as the implications began to sink in, a different timeline started to emerge, one that reframed everything they thought they knew about Emma's disappearance. Detective Morris was already calling for Mrs. Patterson to be brought to the station immediately for questioning, her mind racing through the possibilities that the evidence was suggesting. Within an hour, the Little Lambs daycare was swarming with law enforcement personnel. Crime scene technicians photographed every inch of the secret room, carefully documenting the position of Emma's belongings and collecting evidence that might reveal what had happened in this hidden space 20 years earlier. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson arrived at the police station in a state of obvious confusion and distress, accompanied by her adult daughter, who served as both transportation and moral support. At 78 years old, Mrs. Patterson moved slowly, but still possessed the sharp mind that had made her beloved by hundreds of children and their families over her decades of running the daycare. "I don't understand what this is about," she told Detective Morris as they settled in the interview room. "I already gave you the cassette recorder I found in my attic. Is there some problem with Emma's case?" Detective Morris placed the second recorder on the table between them. "Mrs. Patterson, we found this in the secret room behind the bookshelf at your old daycare. It contains a recording made by Emma Rodriguez on September 16, 2002, the day after she was reported missing from Wilson Park." Mrs. Patterson's face went ashen. She stared at the recorder for a long moment before slowly reaching out to touch it with trembling fingers. "I thought she had gone home," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "On that Friday, September 13th, Emma was acting strange during nap time. She kept asking questions about the weekend. about whether her parents would come to get her on Saturday like they always did. I assumed she was just excited about going to the park. The Rodriguez family went to Wilson Park every Saturday afternoon. Detective Morris leaned forward. What happened that Friday, Mrs. Patterson? Emma didn't nap like the other children. She said her tummy hurt, so I let her sit quietly in the library and look at picture books. But when I checked on her later, she wasn't there. I searched the whole building and found her in that secret room behind the bookshelf. She was hiding there with Mr. Buttons crying. Mrs. Patterson's voice broke as the memory became clearer. She said she was practicing hiding because someone at the park had told her that little girls needed to know how to hide from strangers. She was terrified, Detective. She said a man at the park had been watching her family, had been taking pictures. The photographer, David Carlson, the freelance photographer who had been cleared of any involvement in Emma's disappearance. But what if he hadn't been the only one with a camera? What if there had been someone else? Someone who had used the pretense of photography to observe families and select targets. Did Emma describe this man to you? Detective Morris asked, though she suspected she already knew why Mrs. Patterson had never reported this conversation to police. She said he was nice at first, that he had asked her parents if he could take pictures of their family feeding the ducks. But then he started showing up every Saturday, always watching, always taking pictures. Emma said her daddy had started to notice and didn't like it. Mrs. Patterson broke down completely then, 20 years of suppressed guilt and fear pouring out in choking sobs. I should have called someone. I should have called her parents or the police or someone. But Emma made me promise not to tell because she said her daddy would worry and maybe they wouldn't go to the park anymore. She loved those Saturday trips to Wilson Park so much. What happened on the Monday after Emma was reported missing? Detective Morris pressed gently but firmly. Emma's recording suggests she was at the daycare on September 16th. I came in early that Monday to prepare for the week, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice barely above a whisper. The news about Emma was already on the radio. I was devastated thinking about that sweet little girl and how frightened she must have been. I was in my office when I heard sounds from the library, someone moving around. Mrs. Patterson looked up at Detective Morris with eyes full of pain and regret. I found Emma in the secret room. She had been there since Friday afternoon, hiding like she had practiced. She had somehow gotten out of the building on Friday evening, I never did figure out how, and made her way to Wilson Park on Saturday morning. But when she saw the man with the camera again, the one who had been watching her family, she ran. The timeline was becoming clearer, and Detective Morris felt sick as she realized what must have happened. Emma had indeed been at Wilson Park on September 15th, just as her parents remembered. But when she disappeared into the reeds by the pond, she hadn't been abducted by a stranger. She had been running from one. She ran back to the only safe place she knew, Mrs. Patterson continued. The secret room where she had been practicing hiding. She had a key to the daycare that she had somehow taken from my desk. I never noticed it was missing. She let herself in and hid in that room for 3 days, living on the snacks she had stored there. Why didn't you call the police immediately? Detective Morris asked, though she could see the answer in Mrs. Patterson's face. She begged me not to, Mrs. Patterson said, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. She was so scared, Detective. She said the man had followed her to the park, had been waiting for her family to leave her alone for just a moment. She said he had tried to grab her when she went to look for Mr. Button's button, but she had run faster than he expected. Emma had been more resourceful than anyone had imagined. Faced with a threat she didn't fully understand, but instinctively feared, she had implemented the hiding strategy her father had unknowingly taught her, retreating to a place where she felt safe, while the entire community searched for her in all the wrong places. She stayed with me for 3 days, Mrs. Patterson continued. I was torn apart, knowing her parents were searching, knowing the whole town was looking for her. But Emma was convinced that if we told anyone where she was, the bad man would find her. She had seen him taking pictures of other children at the park, and she was terrified that he was still out there, still looking for her. Detective Morris could hardly believe what she was hearing, but the evidence was undeniable. Emma's possessions in the secret room, the recording with its timestamp, Mrs. Patterson's obvious guilt and remorse, it all pointed to a truth that was both miraculous and tragic. "What happened on the fourth day?" Detective Morris asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Patterson's voice became so quiet that Detective Morris had to lean forward to hear her. "Emma said she wanted to go home. She missed her parents, and she thought maybe enough time had passed that the bad man would have given up looking for her. I offered to drive her home myself, but she insisted on walking. She said she knew a secret way through the woods behind the daycare that would take her to her street without anyone seeing her. I should have stopped her," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice breaking completely. "I should have called her parents, called the police, done something. But she was so determined, and I thought she would be safe once she got home." Detective Morris felt her heart sink as she realized what Mrs. Patterson was about to tell her. Emma Rodriguez had survived her initial disappearance, had hidden successfully for 3 days, had been alive and safe while her family and community searched desperately for her. But something had gone wrong on her journey home. "She never made it," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "I waited at the daycare for hours, expecting to hear that she had been reunited with her family. When the news that night still showed her as missing, I couldn't bring myself to call. I was too scared, too ashamed. I kept thinking she must have made it home safely, and the police just hadn't updated the media yet. 20 years of silence. 20 years of a family's agony, of a community's guilt, of investigators chasing leads that went nowhere. All because a frightened elderly woman had been too scared to make a phone call that could have changed everything." Detective Morris stood up from the table, her mind already racing through the implications of Mrs. Patterson's confession. If Emma had attempted to walk home through the woods on September 19, 2002, there might still be evidence to find. After 20 years, there might finally be answers about what had happened to the little girl who had been resourceful enough to save herself once but not twice. The search of the wooded area behind Little Lamb's daycare began at dawn on March 18, 2022. Detective Morris had assembled a team that included cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar specialists, and forensic anthropologists from the State University. The woods stretched for nearly half a mile between the daycare and the residential area where the Rodriguez family lived, a path that a determined 3-year-old might have attempted if she was desperate enough to reach home. Miguel and Maria were not present for the search. Detective Morris had gently suggested that they wait at home, promising to call with any developments, but Miguel found himself standing at his kitchen window, staring in the direction of the woods where teams of investigators were methodically working through 20 years of accumulated debris, fallen trees and undergrowth. Mrs. Patterson's confession had been recorded and witnessed, and she was being held on charges related to interfering with a police investigation and failure to report a missing child. But Detective Morris knew that prosecuting a 78-year-old woman who had been trying to protect a frightened child would serve no useful purpose. The real tragedy was the lost opportunity. If Emma had made it home safely on September 19, 2002, she would be 23 years old now, living her own life, perhaps with children of her own. The cassette recorder from Emma's secret hiding place had yielded additional recordings that painted a more complete picture of her 3 days at the daycare. She had been scared but not panicked, resourceful in the way that children can be when faced with circumstances they don't fully understand. She had rationed her snacks, had talked to Mr. Buttons about her plans for getting home, had even recorded a message for her parents in case something happened to her. "Hi, Mama and Papi," Emma's voice said on the final recording, dated September 19th, 2002. "It's me. I'm sorry I had to hide for so long, but there was a scary man at the park and I had to run away. I'm going to come home now. I know the way through the woods, and I'll be very careful. I love you so much. Tell the ducks I'm sorry I couldn't feed them this Saturday." The recording ended there, and Detective Morris could only imagine what had happened next. Emma had packed her few belongings, said goodbye to Mrs. Patterson, and set off through the woods toward home. A journey that should have taken a determined 3-year-old perhaps an hour, but one she had never completed. On the second day of the search, one of the cadaver dogs alerted near a fallen oak tree about halfway through the woods. The area was carefully excavated by hand, and what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears, while simultaneously providing the closure that the Rodriguez family had been seeking for 20 years. Emma's remains were found in a small depression near the base of the oak tree, covered by 2 decades of fallen leaves and forest debris. She was still wearing the purple jacket Miguel remembered from that last Saturday at Wilson Park, and Mr. Buttons was still clutched in her arms. The forensic anthropologist's preliminary examination suggested that she had fallen, probably tripping over the tree's massive root system in the dim light of early evening, and had struck her head on a protruding rock. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication that the mysterious photographer or anyone else had found Emma during her journey home. She had simply been a small child navigating unfamiliar terrain in failing light, and she had suffered the kind of accident that could happen to anyone but was particularly tragic when it happened to someone so young and alone. Detective Morris made the call to Miguel and Maria personally, driving to their house to deliver the news in person rather than over the phone. She found them waiting in their kitchen, still at the same table where Emma's original cassette recorder had sat for 20 years, holding hands and preparing themselves for whatever they were about to learn. "We found her," Detective Morris said simply, and watched as 20 years of uncertainty finally came to an end. Miguel and Maria's reaction was complex: grief for the daughter they had lost, relief at finally knowing what had happened to her, guilt over the questions they might have asked differently, anger at Mrs. Patterson for her silence, and beneath it all, a strange kind of pride in Emma's resourcefulness and bravery. "She almost made it home," Miguel said through his tears. "She was so close." The distance from where Emma's remains were found to the Rodriguez house was less than a quarter mile. If she had left the daycare an hour earlier, or if the evening light had lasted a little longer, or if she had chosen a slightly different path through the woods, she might have knocked on her front door while her parents were still out searching Wilson Park with flashlights and desperate hope. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Emma had died on September 19th, 2002, most likely in the early evening hours when she would have been making her way through the woods. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall. There was no evidence of prolonged suffering. She had died quickly, probably losing consciousness immediately after the impact. Mrs. Patterson was released from custody with a suspended sentence and community service, her age and the circumstances of her silence taken into consideration by a judge who understood that prosecuting her would serve no purpose other than revenge. She was required to undergo counseling and to speak publicly about the importance of reporting missing children immediately, regardless of the circumstances. The mysterious photographer who had frightened Emma at Wilson Park was never identified. Detective Morris spent weeks following up on every photographer who had worked in the Cedar Falls area during 2002, but David Carlson remained the only professional who could be definitively placed at the park during the relevant time period, and his alibi was unshakable. It was possible that Emma's 3-year-old perception had transformed an innocent park visitor into a threatening figure, or that someone had been watching families at the park without leaving any trace that investigators could follow 20 years later. Emma Rodriguez was finally laid to rest on April 15, 2022, exactly 20 years and 7 months after she disappeared from Wilson Park. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people: family, friends, investigators who had worked on her case, community members who had never stopped hoping she might be found alive, and other families of missing children who understood the complex emotions that came with finally having answers. Miguel delivered a eulogy that focused not on the tragedy of Emma's death, but on the remarkable courage she had shown during her final days. His 3-year-old daughter had recognized danger, had implemented a survival strategy, had managed to stay safe for 3 days entirely on her own, and had died while trying to return to the parents who loved her. She had been braver and more resourceful than most adults would have been in similar circumstances. Emma spent her last days doing what she had always done, Miguel told the congregation. She was trying to take care of everyone she loved, Mrs. Patterson, whom she didn't want to get in trouble, Mr. Buttons, whom she kept safe in that secret room, and us, her parents, whom she was trying to reach when she died. Even at 3 years old, Emma's instinct was to protect the people she cared about. Maria read from the final recording Emma had made, her voice steady as she shared her daughter's last message. "I love you so much. Tell the ducks I'm sorry I couldn't feed them this Saturday." The Rodriguez family established a memorial fund in Emma's name to support search and rescue efforts for missing children, with particular emphasis on training search teams to look beyond the obvious locations when children disappeared. Emma's case had demonstrated that missing children might be closer than anyone imagined, hiding in places where they felt safe, while the adult world searched frantically in all the wrong directions. Wilson Park installed a new memorial plaque near the pond, where Emma had fed the ducks every Saturday, honoring not just her memory, but all missing children and the families who continue to search for them. The plaque included a quote from Emma's final recording: "The best hiding places are where people who love you can find you." Miguel and Maria finally felt ready to make changes to their house on Elm Street. Emma's room was transformed into a home office, where Miguel worked on the Memorial Fund's activities and Maria wrote letters to other families of missing children. But they kept Mr. Buttons's twin brother, and they kept the cassette recorder on their kitchen table, and every September 15th, they still visited Wilson Park to feed the ducks and remember the daughter who had loved them so much she had died trying to come home. The mystery of Emma Rodriguez's disappearance was finally solved, but her story became something more than a missing person case. It became a testament to the courage of children, the importance of listening to their fears, and the enduring power of love to guide us home, even when the journey is more difficult than we ever imagined. 20 years of questions had been answered, but Emma's legacy continued in the lives she touched, the investigators who were inspired by her resourcefulness, and the parents who held their own children a little closer after learning about a 3-year-old girl who had been brave enough to save herself once and who had died trying to save herself again. If stories like Emma's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of love that guides us home, even in our darkest moments, we share them because they remind us that courage comes in the smallest packages and that every voice, no matter how young, deserves to be heard and believed. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and honor the resilience of the human spirit.